Good morning and welcome. I get to introduce Berta Britz here this morning, who'll be talking with us in just a minute. I'm remembering Berta and I going to that wonderful New York meeting just a couple years ago and sharing a presentation together, sitting in a circle together with some others, and talking and listening and even singing, and I cherish that. Berta Britz offers consultation and training through Berta Britz Consulting. She is a recipient of the 2016 InterVoice Inspiration Award. Berta is on the board of Hearing Voices Network USA. Her ministry, Hearing Voices and Healing, is under the care of Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting. Berta uses the liberation she experienced in the International Hearing Voices community and in Montgomery County Hearing Voices Network, Taking Back Our Power Hearing Voices groups, to inform her collaboration for understanding the experience of living and working with anomalous beliefs and voices and growing compassionate communities. Her deepest passion is for creating spaces that welcome young people growing into their fullest selves. Please welcome Berta Britz.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. My friends told me, just speak from your heart. And they were right. But I didn't trust that enough because I really had a message that I wanted other people to understand. And so I got hooked up with this mic around my neck so that I can look at my notes and my words because I got attached to them. So one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be here is because it renews my hope. And it's just an opportunity that I'm grateful for. I'm also scared because I'm shy, and finding a way to give a message that other people will understand is so important to me and doesn't come easily. I speak because I need to, because my life depends on it. I can't imagine another way to live as a human being unless I speak. Unless I make space to imagine what is possible for me and for others, so that we can live into it, so that we can ethically practice co-creating a more just world. I had an idea of what a keynote speech was. I wrote and wrote, revised and revised, struggled to fit my message into the form I'd assumed. It didn't fit. No degree of wordsmithing or tinkering could carry my message. Finally, I accepted that for us to meet, to do the work of revolution, I must embody it. I must gaze into your faces, to see you and be seen by you, to hear and be heard, to know and be known differently, beyond our inherited forms. I must ask you to step into not knowing, to meet me and each other differently, so we can open familiar structures, disturb them, change our gaze, and co-create something new. I commit to participating, to learning with curiosity, to unleash healing and wholeness that includes and transcends us. To you in this space, I ask that you join me in revolution. What does wholeness look like? I see an old tree, the moon, an ocean, a lake, a river, a waterfall, a flower, a drop of rain. Each is itself, all that it's experienced, the impact it has on its surroundings. When I envision wholeness, I see an aspen grove. Starla King wrote that aspen groves have one root system. When you touch one tree in an aspen grove, you touch all of them, extending back to the very first seedling that created the first roots. I see our evolving communities as an aspen grove of interconnected roots, shared heartbeats. What does wholeness mean? For me, wholeness is home. Being home in myself, experiencing my inner knowing, bringing that home authentically to others, sharing being with others, where I am seen, touched, taught, and loved. As I see you, touch you, teach you, and love you, we co-create home that holds us in our realness. We continually move towards home that welcomes, honors, and holds space for difference, growth, and change. Wholeness exists in stillness and in movement, in cycles of birth, death, and renewal, where our roots connect and we all belong. Months ago, I submitted an abstract for this talk, and the people who give continuing professional education credits indicated that I needed to revise them to show how the talk would tie into mental health work on a professional level. After receiving my revisions, Karen Stern, our executive director, replied, "Of course you'll be preaching to the choir." Her response startled me. I am often challenged to see myself even on the periphery of our choir. Over the course of this talk, I hope you will be able to envision participating in a revolution, building a more diverse, inclusive society while ethically living where we are now. I hope that you will consider and reconsider what wholeness means to you, your families, and those you work with, recognizing that we are all interconnected and our liberations are bound. I want you to locate your own identities, roles, and work in a continuum of wholeness. I yearn for you to begin to create a vision of psychosis and difference that is part of human life, to shift the center of your knowledge to include experiences that you formerly considered other, on the margins, and possibly of less value than your own. I see you envisioning communities beginning to restore social well-being that includes, honors, and uses what others bring. And to those of us who have experienced exclusion and othering, I hope we will envision our healing and wholeness as linked too. Together we can create the choir to include all of us in polyphony, dissonance, resonance, harmony, multiple realities. We will form ourselves in newly minted trust, using knowledge by experience, knowledge by education, knowledge by training, listening, hearing, seeing, and valuing one another. Before I had ever come to experience basic trust, I knew things. Please come with me on a journey of learning about those things. To take this journey, we must all open to not knowing. This requires facing fears and shifting from positions based on scarcity to recognizing the abundance available when we direct energies away from suppression, conquest, control, and towards cooperation, collaboration, understanding, and co-learning. Moving from fight, flight, freeze to connection. Moving from locating problems in individuals to recognizing our inner relations and our social contexts. We can change the social contexts, the structure, and enable building a sustainable whole. We will value and nurture. We will see, value, and nurture communal resilience so that no one must be exceptional to heal and grow into wholeness. I know that I'm not exceptional. I learned from my dividedness, and we all carry dividedness. Mine was developed within relationships and within the cultures I inhabited. My early dividedness reflected the dividedness of the key adults in my life, and later reflected the dividedness of the mental health experts who conceived of me from within their beliefs about pathology. Their dividedness taught me, a searcher for meaning, that my search was futile. They tried to teach me that my experience was behavior to be changed or managed, symptoms to be squashed. We met on a ground of hopelessness and helplessness, and for long periods of time, I buried myself in that ground, living a death in life, a life of subordination and submission to their narrative. This was not because I was given a diagnosis of schizophrenia, though I was. It was because I accepted the power and authority of experts to name me and my experience. I accepted their narrative of dominance, which considered me a passive recipient, not a full human being with agency, capacity to make choices and create change in myself and in my environment. I was afraid, and my fear was met by their fear. They destroyed opportunities to explore with curiosity and discover a multitude of possible paths. As a young adult, when I was just after I had been discharged from a long-term hospitalization, I dared to express myself to a psychiatrist whom I'd hoped would try to understand. Instead, he considered me grandiose, warned me that the meek shall inherit the earth, and took steps to commit me to another hospital. For a long time, I interpreted that biblical quote as another expression of the powerful, arrogantly warning the rest of us to submit. Hector, my most dominant voice, had also demanded that I become more humble. I felt violated, hurt, and abused by that psychiatrist and by that voice. Now, many years later, I see a different meaning in the biblical quote, and also in the message from Hector. I understand both to be encouraging me to keep my heart and mind open to learning, discovering, and growth. I still consider that psychiatrist was stuck in a fear-based abuse of power, that he was closed to seeing me as fully human. But now I call upon myself to courageously face the fear in others and in myself. And attempt to build a bridge arcing across our differences. In our culture, that is revolutionary. We can unite in this revolution when we dare to be seen, when we honor each other's being who we are called to be. This requires listening with humility and recognizing that we are all brave beginners. We can hold the tension of ambiguity, paradox, and not knowing, and then unite to learn and co-create a more just, equitable, and multifaceted cultures. I'm challenged to see myself in you if I don't experience your seeing me. When we breathe through threat and fear, to invite recognition, we build spaces to welcome the many strangers who I am and the many strangers who you are. We create a place of deep hospitality for listening, hearing, seeing, accepting, and understanding multiple realities. I invite you to imagine with me what it means to be human, not to think about dominant, popular, or typical paradigms of mental illness, psychosis, schizophrenia, or extreme states, but to open space in your minds, hearts, imaginations to describe what it means to be human. We can move together towards developing epistemological curiosity. How might we all practice living more fully? Visualize the whole choir. What does wholeness look like? Now I'm going to ask you to take a minute silently and in your mind or on paper, just consider, what is your difference? As you consider your difference, notice the words and images that come to you. Track how your body feels. Now turn to gaze at the person to one side of you and notice how that feels. As we look at one another, we all make both explicit and implicit assumptions. Those assumptions come from our experiences of learning and growing. Often we have not explored the limits of what we've learned or the consequences of accepting a worldview that can limit and harm others and ourselves. We may not have noticed experiences and people who have called into question what we have assumed. However we identify, as psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, nurses, family members, people with lived experience of having been diagnosed and treated, people with lived experiences defined as spiritually guided or liberating, we each have been affected by a common paradigm for understanding and responding to human diversity. We have all been shaped by our cultures, systems, and structures. Sometimes we must disturb those structures in order to build wholeness. How we choose to define or understand what is commonly called psychosis or extreme states as a disturbance is one of those disturbances. Harry Stack Sullivan considered psychosis or extreme states as a disturbance in interpersonal relations. I expand his term, interpersonal relations, to include transcultural relations. I call upon us to cross our cultural borders and learn to use our differences to co-construct home and grow justice. I'd like to pause again and have you consider again to yourselves, what are the ways you've made use of your difference? Again, notice the words and images that come to you, and notice how your body feels. Now turn to gaze at the person next to you again. And notice how that feels. I appreciate that many of you have fought to change stigmatizing words like schizophrenia. And while I respect your efforts, I believe that simply substituting another word will not bring about our liberations. While every altruistic effort counts and may bring some relief to some people, it will not bring liberty. It will not change the systemic devaluing and exclusion of some of us. Liberation happens in relationship, in the space of seeing and being seen, speaking and being heard as equal subjects, valuing who we are in the process of becoming more. No one's perspective from a central, elevated position can draw boundaries that define the terrain of being human. Marginalization assumes that one position is dominant. From that position, others are by definition located outside or beneath. Shared liberty is mutually shaped when we meet with curiosity to know and be known in all of our differences, when we step into changing ourselves and our cultures that we inhabit. We can do that. We can't do that for another person. No one does it alone. It is a participatory process, neither linear nor finite. I speak now directly to my mentors and allies. I recognize that you want to reduce individual and group suffering, and that you do so on a daily basis. I was privileged to be one of those individuals given an opportunity to try to make meaning from my suffering. Through psychotherapy with someone like many of you who did have humility and curiosity. With him, I experienced and learned the power possible in a therapeutic relationship, and also its limits. In the glow of that healing relationship, still back in the early 1970s, I sought education to learn to support individual and social change. I did so incognito. There were systemic reasons why I had to hide my experience-based knowledge. When I returned from long-term institutionalization, I discovered that I needed to hide my full self because discrimination was built into applications for work and education. I was allowed access to opportunities to learn and contribute to society only after I omitted some of my truth. I also carried internalized reasons for hiding my experience-based knowledge, which institutionalization had only reinforced. Identifying as other was also part of the identity I absorbed and learned in my family of origin. Our family interacted with the world incognito. I inherited, learned, and internalized threats from a world where Russian pogroms and Nazis lurked, where new menaces might emerge at any moment, and where the ghosts of living terrorized limited the full flowing of love. And I know that I wouldn't be here at all without those ancestors. As a child, I had experienced my differences' badness, and as an adolescent and young adult, I accepted an identity of mental patient. As a young adult, when I tried to enter society, I felt trapped in the catch-22 of needing to deny many parts of myself in order to fulfill my purpose in the world. I carried shame and knowledge that my difference made me less valuable as a person and precluded my becoming a valued worker or member of society. Today, we see similar systemic discrimination and othering in the barriers our society erects for those seeking asylum, immigration, exiles, indigenous people, people of color, and formerly incarcerated persons. When we see ourselves in them and open to their gifts, the interconnected roots of our cultures will grow stronger and deeper. It is for each of us to do the work of becoming ourselves, and for me this means facing fear and love. When I was in school in Michigan, I met Audre Lorde and experienced her as kin, one of my chosen ancestors. Her words and presence changed me and my words. It was a time when my love for myself, for other women, and for life was germinating and beginning to burst free. Audre Lorde wrote, "In order to be whole, we must recognize the despair oppression plants within each of us. That thin, persistent voice that says our efforts are useless. It will never change, so why bother? Accept it. And we must fight that inserted piece of self-destruction that lives and flourishes in us like a poison, unexamined until it makes us turn upon ourselves in each other. But we can put our finger down upon that loathing, buried deep within each one of us, and see who it encourages us to despise. And we can lessen its potency by the knowledge of our real connectedness, arcing across our differences." When I went to graduate school in 1978, I continued on my path towards integrating my learning with my experience. I joyously brought my sexuality out of the closet while I continued to hide my childhood suffering and my almost indelible identity as mental patient. I read Bernice Goodman's The Lesbian, A Celebration of Difference. Goodman's writing linked with what Audre Lorde had sparked in me and spurred me towards the change I sought for myself and my work. She delineated at least two nurturing models, a sameness stagnant model and a difference creative model. I firmly chose the creative model as I aimed my career towards supporting children to heal and grow. Because of this choice towards difference and creativity, I accepted opportunities to work with children who had experienced crushing adversities, and yet who engaged with me as if I were trustworthy. Their belief in me reinforced my commitment to be trustworthy. We co-created this reality. My capacity to meet them where they were, often on the floor of a playroom, and to respect their own processes through play, creativity, and respectful waiting, enabled nourishing growth, both theirs and mine. My loving curiosity and trust in their own healing enabled us to face terrors, rage, pain, and joy. I was not incognito with them. However, I struggled to share how to use my knowledge with those adults and systems whom the children depended on. I did not feel overwhelmed by facing and being present with the hard consequences a child experienced after having been violated by those that she or he loved and trusted, even when those experiences reminded me of my own early life. My breaking point came when I tried and failed to effectively communicate with a judge who ruled that a man who had sexually abused a young child could have unsupervised visits with that child. I experienced and re-experienced my own powerlessness. Seeing that I couldn't protect young children from abuse made it impossible for me to hold the tension of living fully present with a child's experience and also translating it incognito into a language that could be understood and used by social services and legal professionals. I could not simultaneously hide my secret mental patient identity, hide the effects of overwhelming experiences in my own childhood, and speak truth with power. I spoke truth, but those in authority didn't receive it. And that swept away my trust in my own capacity to speak and hold hope. My own power was frayed and disconnected, and I sank into a disability defined by others and internalized and accepted by me. After the Social Security Administration affirmed my disability, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation declared me ineligible to receive or benefit from rehabilitation services. They found me ineligible, despite my having previously moved ahead in love, work, and education, straddling worlds, standing and moving within and between realities in order to live with purpose and meaning. Experiencing my difference had not disabled me. It was how society interpreted my difference that disabled me and convinced me that my exile was complete. I could never belong in their society. Institutional walls were not necessary. My internal walls were imprisoning enough. The borders of our psychiatric caste system were walls etched on my soul, and I accepted their crushing declaration that I was less than human, and my voices echoed society's judgment. It was only when I gave up living and working incognito, when I returned to mental health recovery work as a peer about 19 years later, that I could resume walking paths toward wholeness. I did not walk alone. My life partner and Quaker community had supported the ground I walked on for years. And yet we were also limited by the shadow our fears cast. Fears blocked not only my capacity to envision my healing and wholeness, but also blocked my community's capacity. My spiritual community fully trusted in experiential truth, that of God in everyone. And we trusted in that of God in everyone and in everyone's common capacity for healing and wholeness. And yet, in spite of that, we shared some limited and limiting beliefs. We lived in a culture where we had inherited the dominance narrative. That narrative depleted our creativity and shrank our capacity to meet those among us whose difference was deemed mental illness. My limiting beliefs changed when I leaped forward in relationship and community with recovery champions in Montgomery County, especially Betsy Gorski, the person who hired and befriended me. And then I experienced a deeper transformation through the mutuality I experienced with my peers. I joined the international community of people who hear voices and those who want to understand and ally with us. I invited my local networks into community with the World Hearing Voices Network movement, and we walked together in believing, belonging, being, and ongoing becoming. Since early childhood, I wondered about knowledge. I was a slow learner and spent time mulling over what it means to know. While I was afraid to ask adults, I wondered to myself, does an ant know it's an ant? What does it experience when I squash it? At 68, I'm still questioning how we learn what we know. Who teaches? Who learns? What counts as knowledge? Now I see learning as an ongoing process that we engage in together as active questioners, not as a process which superior authorities transmit finite knowledge to naive, subordinate recipients. I am no longer afraid to acknowledge not knowing. I honor not knowing as essential for asking questions, discovering and opening space for healing and wholeness, for life, justice, and love. My question today is how to speak about the impact of recognizing that what we've been taught and practiced has caused harm. How to voice the harm without miring myself in guilt or heaping blame onto others. How can we all move from the shame and guilt, the moral injury, to compassion for ourselves and those we've tried to help and might have harmed? How can we change our relationships to not knowing, to acknowledge our limiting and limited beliefs, and to reconnect with our deepest wisdom, the multiplicity of our common gifts, communal gifts? How can we give ourselves to a love that enables us to see that our humanity means that we never fully know, we never know alone, and that living into the questions creates our paths towards wholeness? This September, when I was in Holland for the World Hearing Voices Congress, I heard police sirens. Their wheezing squeals reawakened my child identification with Anne Frank. My parents had taken me to plays based on her diary before I was able to understand them. What I connected with was intense fear and a raw need for secrecy and hiding. The terror of the Nazi sirens and the mysterious gift of a secret bookcase which led to temporary safety. I lived much of my childhood daydreaming about secret passages, which would lead me into extraordinary other worlds where I could face challenges, struggle, and learn important lessons. I yearned to discover a path to make sense of my life where my ignorance wouldn't disqualify or destroy me. Recently, I learned that Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners read the Diary of Anne Frank when they were imprisoned on Robben Island. And my heart was touched and emboldened. Despite having experienced brutal oppression, they maintained space within and between themselves for honoring the human heart and spirit. They didn't succumb to meeting the hatred, fear, and violence of their captors system with their own hatred, fear, and violence. Much of our current political, social, educational, and medical policy is predicated on separating those of us who are different. Laws are limited. Our societies need people to live openly and proudly express our differences. The laws, politicians, educators, and the medical professionals must catch up and join. In the meantime, some of us are incarcerated disproportionately, live shorter lives, and lack standing to make informed, autonomous choices. For equal liberty to grow, there must be listening connections formed across our differences. We can begin that now. There is no need to wait for some future date. Sameness is not a prerequisite for unity. We must enable difference to do the work of making a difference. Let go of an integration that homogenizes diversity, strips away our capacities for using our creative powers of difference. There are multiple possibilities available when we give up trying to force ourselves and others to fit into binary categories. We all suffer the consequences from trying to push ourselves and our varied and beautiful differences into one or another slot. We suffer the consequences of not being able to see or hear ourselves in the other. And we cannot imagine the fullness of discovering new knowledge and developing abundant opportunities. When I returned to work after decades on disability, I was advised that my story would reach people more effectively if I couched it within a context that made sense for them. That was the trauma narrative. They could imagine how life-shattering it was when someone whom I had adopted in early childhood as surrogate family, as my life preserver, died suddenly when I was in high school. Hearing that might enable them to turn towards me with less fear and hopelessness to face hearing about the conflagration of voices that ambushed me without closing a door to connection. My experience could be made intelligible if I used language that others could identify with. And it worked. I found that I could bring experiences which had been so private that they defined and controlled me out into the open, that my voice could be heard, that I could speak in a way that others might bear listening to. And that experience shaped my ongoing questions, brought my formulations within range for reflection, feedback, refining, and co-learning. I still feel fear, a huge tension, a divide within myself for seeing the reality of inequality and oppression, its toll on me and on our societies, and daring to see a more sustainable, equitable whole. Even though holding this tension challenges my capacities, I cannot look away. I'm tempted to avoid conflict, to emphasize our common ground, to voice hope based on our shared values, but that may be premature. While it is true that those of us gathered today may share common wishes and intentions, our experiences have been varied. If I turn towards an ideal harmony without facing real differences, I short-circuit the array of possibilities we can co-create. I must start with my own dividedness, voice my visioning, my sense of unfolding wholeness. And yes, I want you to consider your personal dividedness and its relationship to our culture's dividedness as a necessary step towards our communal wholeness. I must start with mine and listen with enough trust to hear you, acknowledge and gaze through your doors of dividedness, so we can meet and hear our voices growing. One more time, I want you to consider how carrying out your social and professional roles has impacted you. Again, notice the words and images that come to you. and track how your body feels. Now turn to gaze to gaze at the person beside you and notice how that feels. This requires trust. My life began without basic trust. My fears, my terrors pre-existed verbal language, yet I retain knowledge from those times before words. It is knowledge that feels intrinsically my mind knowledge, that I continue to try to make sense of, knowledge that I value. It is knowledge that I want to make use of for myself and for others. I carry simultaneous impulses to turn away, to forget, to deny those experiences embodying terror, chaos, and confusion, and a deep desire to face those experiences with curiosity, to explore, reflect, and consciously discern with you your knowledge from experience and your knowledge from education and training and synthesizing. Let's open our hearts and minds and listen for the familiar and the new in ourselves and in each other. When we truly meet, engage with ourself, with others, with spirit, we move towards greater wholeness and experience love and communal growth. It requires a willingness to practice opening to suffering, fear, and joy. We must listen for all voices to become more, connecting personal and social change. Our gazes meet, and we co-create liberty. When we take the brave step to reflect not only on our good intentions, but on the consequences of seeing others from a framework of inequality, we see the diversity of human beingness, the interconnectedness of all life. We find our wholeness in the shared root systems of aspen groves and in diverse heritages and cultures. Our knowledge grows and our gazes deepen. We see that some of our actions have limited the liberty of others and have harmed us and our families, tribes, and cultures. Paulo Freire spoke of creating communal change by the invention of unity in diversity. We learn to practice presence, locating our authentic power within us and beyond us. With humility, we meet in polyphony, forming a rainbow choir, our voices rising in a mighty stream to celebrate difference and form a living arc of justice, connecting us all towards healing and dynamic wholeness. We are ready enough. We form the revolution in equal liberty in this space. We are that choir now as we meet in this moment, practicing presence. Our eyes, ears, hearts, minds, souls fully open. If not now, when?